Oversupplied. Is it time to admit we finally have produced enough stuff in North American and even global agriculture? My guest Todd Thurman and I dig into a discussion of oversupply and what we're going to do about it in this edition of the Business of Agriculture. Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of the Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, and the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with Pattern Ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field, then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture. Got my buddy Todd Thurman here, friend of show, Business of Ag Success Group co-host, talking about something that, frankly, a lot of people in agriculture don't want to talk about. They don't even like the subject. In fact, they call him dangerous. That's right. Somebody on LinkedIn said that Todd Thurman's points about the fact that we maybe have oversupplied the market and it looks like we're going to have more than enough stuff moving forward, discounting and dispelling a bunch of the myths and rumors about we're going to make more food in the next 40 years than we've made in the last 10,000. All that stuff, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, is bullshit. And the thing is, Todd and I are two of the people out here saying it. We've got enough stuff. Not being mean, I'm pro-agriculture, so is he. But we've got a lot of stuff. And this year, 2024, with the farm income projections being what they are, it's finally time to admit it, we're oversupplied. We've got a whole bunch of discussion on this, and we're also going to even talk about some possible solutions that might be coming down the road. Todd Thurman, you get people kind of wound up on this topic. I don't think you're dangerous. I think you're honest. And sometimes honesty and truth is dangerous.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit surprised when I get an angry response. Sometimes definitely emotional, sometimes an angry response to stuff that to me seems relatively obvious.
Or benign.
Yeah.
By the way, what you and I have been talking about this for a bit, and we're going to go through everything from the reality of Brazil, environmental pushes, the food waste models, which you've done some research on, then to the reality of global production. So let's just go ahead and go with some numbers. The great thing is, if you're listening to this and watching this, you know that Todd's a sharp dude. He was quoted in a Wall Street Journal article that just aired on February 10th. On February 10th, it was online on February 9th. I think it was in the print version of February 10th. We're not eating enough bacon, and that's a problem for the economy. So that's the article, and they were quoting Todd Thurman, who gave some quick pork numbers. His expertise is pork, but it's also all of agriculture. Pork is almost just like, shall we say, a great example of all the stuff, corn, soy, whatever. Give me the gist of the article and how you think is indicative of the mindset in agriculture.
Yeah, I've been telling people that I think in a lot of ways and for a lot of reasons, pork is sort of a canary in the coal mine. I think what we're dealing with in pork, I think for a few reasons, we're going to go through a little faster than other commodities. But I think virtually every commodity is going to go through this sort of transition at some point. And it's really about, one of those things that I talked about, posting online and getting a surprising reaction to was I posted, we're clearly producing more pork today than there is demand for pork globally. And to me, that was just, obvious. I mean, we've got the two biggest pork producers in the world, China and the US, together account for well over half of the pork produced in the world. And we've both been losing significant amounts of money for the last year. And, so to me, that seems like intuitively obvious. But if we go back and look, we're producing a lot more pork in the U.S. than we were 20 years ago and certainly 40 years ago. So in 2023, we produced 12.3 million metric tons of pork. In 2000, that was 8.6 million metric tons. And in 1980, 7.5 million. So
we're up. Let's just use those numbers as an example, because it's hard for anybody to get their hands around million metric tons. Doesn't matter. Let's just do the quantifying of the rate of increase. You went back to the year 2000, one quarter century ago. We're at 12.3 million metric tons, and you said a number that was just about 50% less than that just 5 years ago.
Yeah, so from 2000 to 2023, we're up 43%, and from 1980 to 2023, we're up 64%.
Okay, so here's the thing. Let's just go ahead and do a couple other numbers, because you're saying, okay, that's just pork. Yeah, we make more pork. Most people don't know that. Most people don't know that we are up 43% in 25 years, and what's the number, 60-some percent since the 80s on pork. I'll throw you a couple of numbers on corn and soybeans. We love to make corn in the United States. I just pulled up a stat. We did about 15.1 or 15.2 billion bushels of corn last year, 2023. We were under 10 billion 23 years ago. In the year 2001, we were under 10 billion. We are more than 50%. We are up 150. Think about that. We are more than 50% in 23 years on corn. Same for soybeans. We were around 2.8 billion bushels in the year 2001. Last year, we were around 4.2 billion. We're up more than 50% on soybean production. We're talking about doing this in a scope of essentially a little over 2 decades. And you're saying, all right, what's the problem with that? Feed the world, feed the world. That's what agriculture's mantra is, particularly in the United States. Feed the world, feed the world. We have. So go speak to that, Todd. The point is, our mindset has always been, let's find a barge and some country that will take our crap. And not crap, it's good stuff, obviously. They'll take our agricultural commodities. I think we're done. I don't think there's any more. I think the ports are all full. We don't have any more. There's no more places that a consumer has money and a hungry belly to be fed. That's why commodity prices are where they are. They just said in that article, and you know it, pork numbers right now, Tyson, you're talking about Tyson. They're losing their ass on pork. I'm a shareholder. I don't want them to be losing their ass on pork. The farms are at this where the prices were in 1998, 1999. That's when there was a complete, absolute meltdown in pork in 1998, 99. I don't know what more indicators we need to see to convince agriculture, yeah, we're oversupplied. And here's the thing. I don't think it gets better. I mean, I think that the point is 98, 99, okay, well, you know what? We came back. Yeah, we did. I think that now is a different thing because our productive capacity is so amazing, and so have other countries ramped up their production.
Yeah, and it's going to ebb and flow. I mean, obviously, but I think as we look at really we need to understand where are we at right now, and globally. If you just take a step back and kind of look at it from a global perspective, we're producing about 160% of what the FAO calls the minimum daily energy requirement, right? And so this is the absolute minimum amount of calories on a per capita basis that are required to sustain a healthy population. And so we're at about 160% globally. Here in the US, we're 200%. Yeah. So that is the amount of calories that are made available for consumption. Okay, so that includes consumer level food waste and overconsumption and healthy consumption. Okay. And even in Africa, we're at 141%, right? So, there's only a handful of countries where we're not quite there in terms of meeting at least that minimum daily energy requirement. And none of those are because of a lack of global production, right? And most of it is not even a lack of local production capacity. It's more about, distribution issues, mostly political issues.
Yeah, well, the as I point out in my speeches, the old bitch nun that told me about the starving children in Africa and guilted me for having a candy bar as a kid. The reason that the kid in Africa didn't have a candy bar has nothing to do with me eating a candy bar in Huntington, Indiana when I'm 11 years old. It was economics, distribution, same problem then as it is now. Economics, distribution, wars, food being used as a weapon. If I can keep the warring tribe hungry by preventing food shipments, I starve them, then I own them. Those are the reasons this happens. To your point, we are, if that's not, and you can say, okay, I don't agree with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations assessment on caloric recommendations. Okay, that's fine. But you'd have a hard time looking, any rational thinking person could look and say, my God, we've got surpluses and this rate of production increase. That's the one that's shocking. The rate of production. You're talking about, 50 and plus % growth in less than 25 years on something that, this isn't like something that we didn't do before. That's the other part. Like if it was some brand new venture and we just figured out how to do it, we took something we've been doing for 10,000 years and then ramped it up by 50% in the last little more than 2 decades. That's what's remarkable, the rate of productivity increase.
Right. And then we get concerns about, are we going to be able to maintain that rate of increase? And my point there is, there we have all this discussion about how are we going to feed 10 billion people. We already produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, right? And we just waste a lot of it. We have, a lot of overconsumption. We have issues with distribution, all those things. So, that's sort of my initial point is, we're already overproducing in the sense that we've kind of mission accomplished in terms of, feeding the world from a production standpoint. We got lots of issues to deal with, but from a production standpoint and from a total food volume standpoint measured in caloric needs. And so then the question becomes, well, where are we going from here? Right. And my matrix for kind of thinking about that is, well, the drivers over the last, over all of recorded history, but particularly over the last couple of hundred years, there's been, and I always talk about the 2 main drivers, and that's population growth and expansion of economic resources, right? So you've got more mouths to feed and you've got more resources per capita that people have available to them to consume more food and consume higher quality food. Okay.
And those have been the 2 drivers. First off, because of the demand was there, it forced us to get good. And then with a commodity system, particularly within the last 100 years, particularly within the last 100 years, places like the United States, Canada too, most of the developed world, but particularly let's just talk about here at home. We invented the CME group. We invented this commodity thing. We commoditized and standardized things like number 2 yellow corn is 56 pounds per bushel, those types of things. And it was because we had this rapid population growth, not just here at home, globally, from 6 billion people on Earth just 25, 30 around Y2K to about pushing 8 billion now, if you believe the UN. Population growth alone won't do it because a bunch of poor, starving people, more of them, they don't eat. But the thing is, we had an economic situation globally in the last 25 years, 50, even 100, that also made it so that those people could eat. And you're talking about pretty significant changes, as you referenced that maybe in the United States, we always ate around, 50 pounds of pork or 70 pounds of beef or whatever. But you're talking about huge changes in some of these developing countries. And that economic thing, as much as population, made it so that they ate better. And we've heard this a lot in ag. Well, they're going to continue, you give somebody a pay raise, they're going to buy more meat. That's why we got to make more pork. We're there. That's your point, is that we're already kind of saturating. Population growth, as you and I both talk about, is not expanding. The population is going to start declining. You can go back and listen to our past episodes, dear listener, if this is all new to you. If this flies in the face of what you've been preached to in ag your whole life, which it does, go back and listen to Todd and I talk about what a shrinking population means for ag. It's a past episode. But then the economic part, I think economies still improve a little bit to drive this. So we know population is not going to happen, but I don't think economic expansion is going to make it so that we can just keep making more pork or soybeans.
Right. So it's I'll talk about those 2 drivers, and I've actually recently added a third to my my talking points there, and that's globalization. And the reason I think that's an important perspective there is to understand that globalization opened up a lot of markets for countries like the U.S. that are really good at producing certain commodities, and allowed them to take this excess production and fund markets for it around the world. So if you think about population growth, economic expansion, and globalization being those 3 primary drivers over the last 50 to 100 years, the population growth we know is slowing and will sometime in the next few decades. It's not really controversial that global population is going to peak at sometime in the next few decades. whether it's 2050 if you're more aggressive, or whether the UN you're at 2086. It's a matter of when, not if. And the rate at the expansion is definitely slowing down significantly. So the rate of growth in the global population peaked in the late 1960s at a little over 2% a year. Now we're at like 0.85%, and we're going to very quickly get down to 0.5% globally. So, that's definitely going to be reversing soon. Exactly when is a subject of debate, but it's definitely going to be reversing. And it already is in about 25% of the world, in terms of about 25% of the global population currently lives in a country that has a declining population.
And by the way, this is completely new to so many folks, and you and I have been talking about it for a long time. Well, me longer than you picked up on it, which I appreciate. But the point is, if you have lesser people, but they have good economics, that means they eat better, which could be good for ag. But again, this is going to be a reversal in our thinking. We think eat better means eat more, make more commodity grade pork, produce more corn, more soybeans, more, cheap chicken. And that's not really what we're talking about. There's the hope that a decreasing population growth with good economic numbers still could buy up, meaning pay more versus just buy, versus more quantity means more quality.
Right. And there's still going to be an opportunity, especially in Africa, to see expanded quantity of food even, and certainly expanded quantity. When you get around the economic issues, it's a lot more murky. And so what I've been telling people is, I'm not an economist. Projecting what's going to happen over the next 20 or 30 years in terms of economies is a fool's errand, right? But if we're able to continue to expand the global economy at the same rate we have over the last 50 years, we're going to be doing it against some very significant demographic headwinds, right? So, can we do it? I don't know. My intuition is that it's going to be, a lot slower growth rate than what we've experienced in the past. And that's because we're going to be up against in the biggest economies in the world, we're going to be up against some pretty big headwinds. And then the third one, where are we going with globalization? Again, that one's a lot more difficult to project, but I think clearly in the recent past, we've seen a step back from globalization. And I think we're probably going to see more of that moving forward, which is not optimistic in terms of, especially for exporting economies, is not particularly optimistic.
I want to talk about what globalization has done for us and then what it won't do us moving forward. Before I do that, I want to talk about Truterra. Truterra is one of my sponsors here in the Business of Agriculture. Truterra is, they're a subsidiary of Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes has been around for more than a century. You can trust them. Truterra is focused on supporting farmers at every stage of the sustainability journey to help plan, make, and maintain regenerative management practices and improve your agronomic and economic as well as environmental sustainability on your operation. Okay, maybe sustainability is one of those words that just puts your bullshit meter up. It probably does. It does for me, but dig this. We were talking about if you're a landowner or farmer, you're going to have some really, really tight margins this year. What if you could diversify your revenue stream by getting paid for doing things like cover cropping, reduced tillage, things that are going to actually be good for your soil, good for your bottom line? You're going to be taking less trips across the field, perhaps. If you reduce your tillage, all of a sudden, good for you. And you can get paid to do so. TruterraAg.com. Go to TruterraAg, Truterra, TruterraAg.com. Figure out maybe if you can start making some money for doing these practices. It's a little bit of side revenue. It's good for your bottom line and also good for your soil. All right. Globalization has been great for the things like you talk about. We used to be a net importer of pork only just 20 or 30 years ago. 25% of the pork we produce now gets put on a ship and goes somewhere else. We send the hell out of soybeans, obviously. China's the biggest customer of our soybeans. We ship a whole bunch of our soybeans over there. That's the biggest agricultural export that we have here in the United States. But it's going to start changing. It's going to change because of some military and some conflict. It's going to change for what other reasons?
Well, there's a lot of reasons, and a lot of it is really kind of an over reliance on exports, and a lot of this got highlighted during the COVID pandemic, where you had supply chain disruptions, and you started, people started looking at these risks that people didn't even really know were there, how dependent we were on China for certain, critical commodities. There was a lot of discussion around chips, and even before that, in the swine industry, we had an eye-opening event when we had African swine fever, and we realized how dependent we were on some of those feed ingredients coming from China. When people said, "Oh no, they have African swine fever, we don't want to bring in any ingredients from China," and a lot of them heard back from their feed suppliers that was impossible because there was not enough supply outside of China to be able to exclude that, even if we wanted to, right? And so it was a really eye-opening situation where countries around the world realized that they were a lot more reliant on international, not just specific countries, but international networks, and a lot of times it was multiple countries that had to play a role before we could get what we needed. And so we had developed a very complicated global supply chain that, improved efficiency significantly, but also reduced resiliency at the same time. And so, again, how long that's going to last, and how, are we going to see a permanent step back from globalization towards deglobalization? Who knows for sure, but clearly we're moving in the opposite direction right now and for the foreseeable future.
I think that the globalization, like you said, it highlighted our vulnerabilities, but it also, we in North American agriculture have always thought, let's keep producing stuff. We want to make more stuff. Let's just find a market. And what are these checkoff programs in many ways tasked with doing? Developing markets, creating demand. Let's send a contingent of wheat farmers from the Pacific Northwest over to Asia and shake hands with these Asian people and tell them how much they are going to love using our flour to make, whatever it is that they make in the Philippines out of American flour. We've done that, and we do that, and we do that. Potatoes. I mean, I've worked for all these trade groups. No offense, that's what you're doing. I get it. You're working on behalf of your growers and saying, let's go find them, develop. We might be tapped out.
It's been enormously beneficial. So I don't want to imply that that's been a bad thing. I mean, globalization has been a great thing.
It's been a great thing for
almost everyone in the world.
The thing is, I think it's run. I don't think we're going to globalize our way out into 50% more production of stuff. I mean, it's like we're about there. Like remember, Brazil produces the shit out of stuff. Back when Ukraine was not being invaded, they produced a bunch of stuff. Kazakhstan, India, for God's sakes, Australia. I don't think that we're going to globalize ourselves to another 50% to justify another 50% growth in corn, soy, pork, whatever.
Well, and I did a survey on LinkedIn, it's been quite some time ago, where I asked, in 25 to 50 years, are there going to be more opportunities to export commodities or less, or about the same? And I was pretty surprised that most people thought there was going to be more or the same opportunities. And to me, it's pretty clear that there's going to be less, and a lot of times people will point to, oh, well, this is going to shift. Yeah, we're seeing some, less opportunity in East Asia, but there's more opportunity in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, that's true. But in the past, when we've seen these shifts in markets, the other markets were still growing. Right. And so now what we're doing is it's almost like you're running backwards on a treadmill in a way, because that growth in Africa has to not just create new opportunities, but has to offset the decline in some of these other markets. And so that becomes a lot bigger challenge, and not one that we've ever really faced before to any significant degree.
There's another thing that I tell my audiences about this feed the world mantra is that, as you said, we already produce more than enough to feed the 7.7 to 8 billion people that we have on Earth. It's just those that are food insecure because of distribution economics, war, food being used as a weapon, tool, whatever, tool of control. We waste about 35% of what we produce globally. And you've done a little bit of studying on this. Let's just say, so if you think we're not already oversupplied now, and you and I both are amused at or are amazed at people that don't even comprehend when we say the word oversupplied. What do you mean? What do you mean? Well, that's why hogs are actually a losing proposition right now, or producing soybeans might be a losing proposition right now. Jim Wiesmeyer, by the way, I just recorded with him, Todd, he says that we really could see sub $4 corn and sub $11 soybeans. So if you want to know what oversupply means, that means that there's so much of it on the global market. That's why we're not selling it. Imagine then if we start correcting the food waste problem that we have globally. Let's just say that 1/3 of what we waste, which is what we waste 1/3 of what we produce. Imagine we stopped wasting 1/3 of what we do waste. In other words, instead of 35% of food being wasted, it went to 25. Holy shit, that throws back more into the supply. That makes more of the supply issue. I mean, everything that doesn't get wasted then just contributes to more surplus.
And it's really hard to say. I know, we've been working on a project to try to project food demand, first in China, and to use that sort of as a model, and then trying to, expand that. And I'll tell you, it's extraordinarily difficult, and gets very complex very fast. But, one of the factors that we've been looking at really closely is food wastage. And one of the things that I've been trying to tell people, within our circle that's working on this is, do you really think that food wastage is not going to be less in 20 years than it is today? I mean, it seems to me rather obvious that if for no other reason, just for environmental reasons, right, that is going to have to be reduced. Now, to what degree and how quickly do we get there? Those are very reasonable open questions, but I can't imagine that we're not going to have a significant reduction in food waste, which is great for the environment. It's, it's something that we need to make a priority, but the reality is less food waste is less quote unquote demand. And so, we've got to factor that in. And there's some preliminary results from some of the work that we've done on China between now and 2050. We're expecting about a 13% reduction. And don't hold me to that because we haven't finalized this, but we're expecting about a 13% reduction in total caloric food demand in China between now and 2050. And about 4% of that is food waste. And that's a very conservative estimate. Yeah. So the sustainability goals for the UN say we're going to cut food wastage in half by 2030. Well, that's not going to happen. So what we said is for the China model, which the Chinese government's been very aggressive about reducing food waste. It's because it's a national security issue for them. Yeah. They're a net importer of food. And so what we used in our model, that we came up with this 4%, a little over 4%, what we used in the model was a 25% reduction in between now and 2050, as opposed to a 50% reduction between, 2020 and 2030. And so that's where we came up with that 4%. So we think that's a pretty modest, estimate of where we could be at in terms of food wastage, and 4% in a market that is, currently about 20% of the global population. That's very significant. So I think we're underestimating the potential impact of food waste. And part of that's because it's really hard to, see where we're going. But surely, we're going in a direction of less food wastage between now and mid-century.
Yeah. And again, the person and I don't care if you didn't take an economics class or not. It's, we talk about supply and demand issues, but it's real simple here. If we're wasting 1/3 of what we make and then we stop wasting as much of it, it just continues to then be a supply that actually might get consumed, which means then we've got a boatload of supply. One other then thought, alternative uses. I am totally opposed to putting solar panels in the Midwest where it's got adequate precipitation, some of the best farm ground in the world, like where I'm from, or Illinois or Indiana, Michigan, okay, maybe not Michigan. Anyway, but why the hell are we doing it? I'm opposed to it because of government policy that financially makes this rewarding. But I'm not opposed to it because I think it's going to starve us. There are people that, think, oh my God, we're going to put these solar panels in there and all of a sudden we won't have enough food. I'm opposed to it just from a moral conviction, but also from a standpoint, it doesn't make economic sense. I don't know why you're putting solar panels in Northeast Indiana when we don't get sun half the year. But alternative uses of land, alternative uses of the products we produce, and we're going to get into ethanol and biodiesel and all that here in a minute, that will or should decrease the supply, which then adjusts the situation to current demand.
Yeah, and really, a lot of this is sort of this treadmill effect, right? Where we're making increases here, and then we have decreases there, and the calculation, the right calculation, is trying to find the balance between those two, and that's where it becomes really complicated. But we've been improving our productivity at a pretty consistent rate over the last 50 to 100 years. Is that going to continue? It's hard to imagine that we're not going to continue to improve. Does that rate of, improvement increase, decrease, or stay about the same? That's an interesting discussion to have. I don't see any reason to think that it's going to decrease significantly. Yeah, we're going to have some challenges. Maybe climate change is going to create some challenges, but, one of the things that I hear about climate change all the time is it's going to reduce our yields. And I'm like, well, in some places probably so, but in other places it's going to increase it. So again, we get back to this, trying to find that balance between, what's the ultimate impact going to be. The climate change thing, it's not going to be all negative. So some of that negative impact is going to be mitigated by positive impact. So, there's a lot of questions about how that plays out.
Non-ag people, I've been asked this in interviews about, are we all going to starve because of climate change? I said, well, first off, climate change is as much religion as it is science, number one. Number two, do you even know anything about yields? They said, what? And then I've had people that are non-ag people that interviewed me and said, well, it's pretty obvious that all these yields are going down and we're not even able to make food. I said, I don't know where that's happening. I can tell you it's not happening in Nebraska. I can tell you that we are making more food with less resources than we ever have. Whether you think the weather's changing or not, it's not affecting our productive capacity. What about then? Okay, so we covered a bunch of those things. Alternative uses. This is where the ag people get very excited. I just attended this session at Top Producer in Kansas City last week, and I heard Pete Meyer, who's been on this show, talk about renewable diesel, biofuels, if you will. And this, man, you talk about a bunch of people that are very excited. The ag crowd is very excited, Todd, about the idea that we're going to now have a reason to use more soybeans to make diesel, more corn to make ethanol, which then might go into sustainable aviation fuel. It's a big deal.
Yeah, and that's been a big part of the story that I think is probably a lot more appreciated within the ag community than it is outside the ag community. But I think the general public would be shocked to find out that about 40% of the U.S. corn crop goes to ethanol production. I mean, that's a remarkable number. You start thinking about that increase that we've seen over the past, 20 years in terms of corn production. Most of that increase has gone not to animal feed and not to human consumption, but most of that increase has gone to ethanol production. So, how sustainable is that? I mean, sustainable is kind of a loaded term these days, but how sustainable is that? Is that going to continue to be a viable destination for a lot of this quote unquote overproduction? But as we look at food production, that's not food production, right? So most of that growth has not gone to food. Most of that growth in the corn and to a lesser degree in the soybeans has gone to fuel, not food.
Yeah. Okay. So, and which is fine, by the way. In no way are we against this, but there's this hope that, and I've heard it, and we've had it on here. Are we going to need 18 million more acres of soybeans, which would be a 20% increase in acres of soybeans to fuel the biodiesel or renewable diesel, I should say, renewable diesel thing? I said, well, maybe if renewable diesel becomes a thing and it's derived out of soy, what if that new demand, which is actually created, that it's kind of fake demand, is through standards or tax incentives by the U.S. government, just as ethanol was with the renewable fuel standard, where it incentivized ethanol production starting 20 years ago. What if it just offsets the global demand that we're losing? What if it just offsets China? What if it just offsets the fact that Brazil's rolling in? Some articles say that Brazil might bring 90 million more acres into production that are not being farmed right now over the next decade. That's the total number of acres that we use to plant soybeans in the United States. It's a little more than that, actually, about 86 million here. Good God, talk about oversupply. You're talking about bringing on, potentially in the next decade, the entire equivalent of U.S. soybeans onto the market in the next decade. You want to talk about oversupply? I think we just made sure we more than fed the world, we flooded it.
Well, and that's exactly right. And I think these are all productive conversations to have. And what I'm trying to argue for, and I think what you're trying to argue for as well, is we need to get past this, feed the world more. We need to produce more, volume of food, more food in the next 40 years than the last 10,000 years combined. We've got to get past that so that we can have these types of discussions, so that we can have a discussion around, is that really going to happen? Is Brazil really capable of doing that? And what does that look like? These are the discussions we need to be having. I'm not trying to avoid having these discussions. I'm frustrated because this obsession with we've got to produce a lot more food in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years is making it very difficult to have the kind of discussions that we need to have, which are around, these, fuel issues. Is this a long-term play, or is this going to be a temporary thing? That's a discussion we need to have. I don't have all the answers to that. I don't have hardly any of the answers to that, but I do know that if we can't get past this situation where we're just, being driven on a narrative that is the last 50 years narrative, not the next 50 years narrative, we're going to have a really hard time having the right conversations as an industry.
I started telling my ag crowds almost a decade ago, I said, ethanol was a short-term solution to a long-term problem. And again, ag, it's ballsy to say that when you're in front of the Iowa Corn Grower Association, trust me, but I said it because I said, guys, I'm a little bit of an ag historian. We invented soil bank in the 1950s, which was a precursor to CRP, which came in mid-1980s. Mid-1980s, we said, let's take 23 million acres out of production. The idea was it would decrease supply, particularly of corn. 1983, we had a thing called the PIC program. It lasted for a couple of years. We had so much of a glut of corn, we paid farmers with corn to not plant corn. Some of my listeners have heard me talk about this before, but it's worth repeating. We've had a long-term problem of too much corn, arguably since the 50s, but for sure since 1983. We had so much of it, we paid people with corn to not plant corn. We invented the renewable fuel standard in 2004, signed into law by George W. Bush. 2004, we're in our 20th year now, our 21st year starting, and it was to burn through corn. Like you said, 40% of the corn crop goes to ethanol. It's propped up demand. I'm not being mean. How would you say it's anything but? It invented a demand. It invented a tax incentive to produce, brew, distill, boil, whatever you want to call it, to make ethanol and also to use it in the blend. Well, if we do the same thing on soybeans, that's good. That's demand. It's artificial demand. I'm not sure it's enough. When we're talking about a commodity, Todd, that we increased by 50% in the last 22 years on production, because once you tell a farmer, hey, we got this new soy plant over here, plant soybeans, by God, they'll go to the field and they'll grow you more soybeans. It's what they want to do. And I understand that. I just don't think it's enough I don't see it being enough to compensate for the oversupply we're going to have moving forward.
Well, and what you described that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years there in those commodities is in an environment where all three of those things that I talked about earlier in terms of the drivers were still moving in the quote unquote right direction. Population growth was still moving along at a pretty significant clip. The economic expansion was, it's the biggest that we've really ever had over the last 20 or 30 years. And globalization was having its heyday over the last 20 or 30 years. So, a lot of this goes back to our normal is not normal. What we've been living in, most of us, for the majority of our lives,
our careers, at least our careers. If for sure, careers the last 20 or 30 years, you've really, you can say, we've seen bad times, 1980s. I get all that, but in general, like you said, we've seen expansion of global economics. We've seen huge growth of population globally, and population of a buying of a consumer class, and the globalization. Pre World War II, we didn't ship stuff all around. There weren't people in some foreign destination, clamoring for Tyson produced chicken breasts. It's like you said, but is it going to change? It's at least not going to keep advancing, is my thought. It might stay this way, but that's where we are.
Yeah, and so as we start thinking about moving forward, we have to understand that what we've come to accept as normal was actually a sweet spot. It was a demographic, economic sweet spot, and it's going to be very difficult to maintain the economic piece and impossible to maintain the demographic piece. And so we have to start thinking about, what does this look like? What if what had happened with the expansion of ethanol had happened in an environment where, global demand was slowing instead of growing rapidly, right? So we just got to start thinking about these things. And then the other thing that I think we just have to mention is that we have a lot of eggs in the African basket. Right. If we start looking at the net population growth between now and 2100, so the difference in what the UN is projecting, and we can have that discussion about whether the UN is being overly optimistic or whatever. But if we just use the UN numbers, which is what I do in most of my discussions to avoid that argument, if we use the UN numbers, about 92% of that net population increase from today to 2100 is going to be coming from sub-Saharan Africa alone. Yeah. So if they're getting Africa wrong, we have a major problem, right? So we have to look really closely. And I'm pretty optimistic, to be honest with you. I think I'm pretty optimistic about Africa's economic prospects, but you'd be a fool to look at Africa and say it's going to be easy. So what I told someone the other day is I said, all these discussions about this huge demand that's going to be coming from Africa all start with if Africa can get their governance issues under control, right? If they can get it together. Well, that's a huge if. Anybody that's spent any time looking at Africa, like I said, I'm pretty optimistic about that. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of downside potential. If that doesn't come through, whether that's because they can't get their economic act together, or if it's because they get their economic act together faster than everybody projected, and their demography starts changing faster than anybody predicted, then we've got a real problem. And so, that's going to be happening in the environment of a decline, primarily in East Asia and in Europe, but later even in Latin America. So, we've got a lot riding on what's going to happen economically and demographically in Africa. And I hear very little discussion about that, and that's concerning.
Well, let me just tell you that if I were an investor, and whatever that number was, $1 million, $1 billion, $1 trillion, and you said, you're going to put this all on ag's future, and it's predicated on the growth of sub-Saharan Africa as a marketplace, I would pull my money off the table almost immediately because of, first off, it's predicated on them having a rapid expanding population, which that's the only part of the world that is having still increased fertility rate. That number two, it's the year 2024. Africa has still never had its moment. You're saying, well, its moment is coming. The Washington Nationals, someday we're going to beat the Harlem Globetrotters also, and it just never came. I mean, I just don't see this happening. And then the other part of it is, as you said, there's some cultural and marketplace issues that are pretty vast. You're not talking about, first off, it's not one country. It's a huge continent, but it's not one country. So you've got, from Ivory Coast to Nigeria to where you start going through these places, you're talking about, it's not like we picked up China. We picked up 1.3 billion people pretty much like that. Around the year 2005, I'd say 20 years ago, they started really becoming a customer. By 2008, every ag seminar you went to, they talked about China, China, China. If every Chinese person eats one more cheeseburger per week, that means that all the kill facilities in Dodge City, Kansas are maximized, blah, blah, blah. Every hack ag economist, you've heard me say this, took 1.3 billion. We picked up China with 1.3 billion people, essentially with one. There's not 1.3 billion people in one country. Africa is a continent, not a country. We got to now try and negotiate terms with this little country of 8 million and this little country of 3 million. And that I just think if I'm an investor and I'm predicating my entire outlook in ag on Africa, I'm pulling my money off the investor table.
Well, I think there is a compelling argument on both sides of that. I think, there's an argument around there's going to be a concentration of global wealth that's looking for a growth market. And there's only going to be, that's going to be the only region in the world where there is that traditional growth market. And a ton of capital comes in there, and then you have a lot of incentive for them to get their act together. But I also am very, sympathetic to, your argument, which is, yeah, we've been saying that for a while and it hasn't come to fruition. And there's a lot of really deep systemic challenges that we're going to have to overcome in order to generate the kind of demand in Africa that we saw in China. And again, I'm coming back to this. When we saw that in China, everywhere else was growing too at the same time. This demand that we're trying to generate in Africa, that we're trying to encourage in Africa, is going to have to offset a lot of reductions in demands in other parts of the world that have traditionally been very important markets for us.
I'll throw you another one. In addition to the fact that it's so fragmented with that population, isn't it roughly the same? The whole part you're talking about, roughly the same population as China, but it's between 31 countries or something. So it's very challenging economically and politically, I should say. But the other part of it is China became a great ag customer because they had an economic expansion like none in recorded history, other than maybe the United States industrialization, in the 1800s. On double-digit economic expansion every year, year over year over year, where they had these factories, and all of a sudden that consumer had the money to go and buy another pork chop. I'd have a hard time believing that massive amounts of manufacturing is going to move to sub-Saharan Africa. So therefore, that customer base, while it might be there, generally their entire economic model has been extractive, natural resources. It's not been value added. So I think that's going to be a real challenge. Let's talk about what other things that you and I see when we look at answers to the oversupply, because we're not negative Nancy's here. I know this is a long episode, folks, but this is a topic that I'm telling you, it's just like population. This is a topic that Todd and I are going to be probably hitting again. We cover it in our Business of Ag Success group. If you want to be a member, it's only $99 a month. We get together with smart agricultural people and network every 2 weeks on a Zoom call, and we have guest presenters. You should join. Also, I'm going to tell you about my new sponsor, Redox. Redox and I teamed up here in 2024 as a sponsor. They're a Burley, Idaho-based company. I know you hear a lot about biological companies. It's a lot of, let's face it, pixie dust. Well, guess what? Redox is a sponsor here because I actually did a little research on them. They're not just a bunch of investors that threw some bugs in a jug and tried to market the hell out of it. They've been around for 30 years. Darren Moon started the company 30 years ago. They got a huge track record in turf. They're working more into row crop acres, and you should really give them a little sniff. Redox Bionutrients provide superior nutrition, abiotic stress defense, root growth, soil health, and efficient nutrient uptake with a 30-year track record. Find out more at redoxgrows.com. Check out the Redox Grows podcast. They actually had me on one of their episodes, and I think you should check it out, redoxgrows.com. Answers to oversupply. If we even get people to admit that there's a supply problem, there's going to be those that say, Todd, I remember this in the 80s. We had too much stuff. Then all of a sudden, we had things went crazy, 2005 to 2013, then again from 2019, 20 till now. This is just a blip. We're not oversupplied. It'll be just like the old days. Your answer.
Well, like I said earlier, I think we will see some ebbs and flows, and that's going to make it easier for people to say, see, this was, your concern was overstated or whatever, that, we're moving back in the other direction. We're definitely going to see some ebbs and flows, but I think, at a macro level, I think that's the direction that we're moving in. And so what are the solutions? I think a broad discussion around what does a shift towards quality and away from quantity look like is really where we need to be having these discussions. And what exactly does that look like? I don't know. I mean, I have some ideas, but I think it probably is going to mean different things in different commodities. It's going to mean different things in different parts of the world. But, in order to have that broad shift away from this quantity-driven commodity mindset towards more of a quality-driven mindset that maybe incorporates some of the aspects of the traditional commodity system, but makes it look, a lot different. I think that's the kind of discussions that we need to have. And I really try to avoid being too prescriptive about that, because my position really is, let's bring the industry in. This is an innovative industry full of innovative people. Yep. If we get them focused on the right thing, they're going to come up with solutions to these problems, right? But just to kind of spur some ideas, you and I have talked about, what if we have a commodity system, approach that is, instead of becoming more standardized, becomes less standardized? centralized, and we have, instead of just having commodity pork, we have a market for, highly marbled pork. And then we have a market for leaner pork. And we have a market for, XYZ, whatever that, however you define quality, we have a different market for that. And so we can preserve some of the aspects of the existing system, but applying it a different way. But again, it just gets back to having to get away from this, old narrative and wrap your mind around the new paradigm.
Well, obviously, feed the world, feed the world. We've been hearing, and there are people, like I said, that as you and I both joke about it. We joked about before we hit the record button. We joked after we hit the record button that they question us, or we get told. I just got told I don't know anything about agriculture. Guys, just wait. If you're gonna insult me on a social media post where I actually put out something that's heady, intelligent, and might challenge your thinking, let's at least make it a plausible criticism. Say that somebody like Todd and I don't know anything about agriculture is a little bit ludicrous. So anyway, here's the thing. We still have that commodity mindset. And so if you and I said, hey, I get it, the farmer's got to do what the farmer's got to do to try and keep their head above water. And that sometimes that means playing the government program or being a commodity producer. Yeah, trust me, I don't think there's any money being made in corn and soybeans, but with my crop insurance and my revenue insurance, I get it why you do what you do as a producer. But what about the processors or the value added post-farm stuff, the Tysons of the world, whatever it is? We still have this commodity mindset. Let's make it, put as cheap a chicken out there, because by God, we've grown it to almost 100 pounds of chicken consumption per American per year from about 30 pounds of chicken consumption per American per year 50 years ago because we made it cheap. I get that. I don't think we can sell anymore just on cheapness. So is there a value added? And I've talked about this a lot in ag, and I get it. It's not that I'm just saying that these farmers got to do it, but even the commodity groups are still just out there saying, let's figure out a way to lobby for more ethanol or lobby for more trips to Asia to sell flour. What about nutrient density versus just, and this is going to really rattle. The CME group was never, the whole entire commoditization and standardization, Todd, was never predicated, never had any basis in nutrition. It had to do in standardizing pounds, bushels, what a contract is, so many pounds. It's all about standardization of the transaction, not of the actual quality of the product.
Well, and if you want to understand what farmers do, look at what they're incentivized to do. You talk about that article about pork and kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. The reporter asked me when we were talking on the phone, what do we have to do to change this? We've probably gotten the pigs too lean, right? What do we have to do? Well, we have to change the incentive structure, because the incentive structures are all aligned to reward producers for producing, really lean pork. And so if we want to, shift away from that, we have to adjust those incentive structures. Same way with corn and soybeans, all those incentive structures are aligned around volume and not, about quantity and not around quality. And so, in order to shift that mindset, ultimately, we're going to have to shift those incentive structures. And those aren't things that are changed easily.
No, and you can say it's mindset, but some of it's not mindset. It's because of the economics. I mean, let's face it, the person that's in the Nebraska hog producer is doing what they're probably financially incentivized to do. So it's got to come from above that. But here's the one thing that I guess I want to tackle mindset, because you'll hear it, and you and I do hear it, whether it's from critics or even people just questioning, the stuff that you and I put out there. Well, the consumer won't pay for it. And I said, well, I'm not sure that's true. I actually went to Whole Foods 2 weeks ago to do a little research. I do that sometimes because there's a Whole Foods around the corner here, and it's an affluent neighborhood. And I watch what people are paying for. And yeah, with food inflation being in its third year now, I'm sure there's a little bit of a challenge, but you've still got a consumer that does pay up for something that they deem. Whether you do or I do doesn't matter. It's what the consumer does. They pay for something. So there is that, I think, opportunity for continually diversified value, whatever that should mean to that consumer, whether it's blessed by a rabbi or more fat or, raised by monks or whatever the hell the story is. I still think that there's more to be tapped there, although it's a bit challenging in an era of our third year of increasing food inflation.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of opportunity there, and but I think it's difficult to have that discussion about what that looks like, what that quality looks like when we're still stuck in this old paradigm. And so, a lot of times I get pushback when I say, look, we're already producing enough food to feed 10 billion people. Everybody's asking, how are we going to produce enough food to feed 10 billion people? Exactly the way we do today, because we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, right? Today. And we're increasing every year, right? So, I lose zero sleep about worrying about how we're going to feed 2 million people. I'm worried about how we're going to feed 7 billion people, right? What does that look like? And so, and again, people push back and say, well, those are long trends. Yes, but these are very entrenched systems that have to be adjusted. And the longer you wait to have that discussion, the longer you wait to make these transitions, the more painful those transitions are going to be. And so a lot of this stuff, even when we get back to the population thing, a lot of times I get pushback on that. Was that necessarily a bad thing? Well, no, it's not really whether it's good or bad that our population is declining. It's the transition period that's the problem, right? It's, would we be better off at 7 billion people than 10 billion? Maybe. There's a lot of really, really good arguments to be made for that. But it's not about, you can't just skip over the hard part of transitioning from, 9 or 10 billion to 7 billion. You got to go through that process, and that process is going to be difficult. That process is going to be painful. And so it's about, what can we do to minimize the impact of that transition period? And so, to me, we're behind schedule in terms of having that discussion as an industry to begin to talk about engaging those resources to start coming up with answers. And the longer we wait, the more painful it's going to be, and the less we're going to like the solutions. One of my concerns is the ideas that are out there are not ones that are very palatable to me. There are very few of them are free market solutions. Very few of them are, capitalist oriented solutions. They look a lot like policies that have failed in the past. So that's the problem.
And I want to get to supply management, but before I do that, when you just talk about the painful, this is the thing, and this is where if I don't know what to challenge the thinking where like they think you and I are crazy for talking about, are we oversupplied? It's no question we're oversupplied. That's why the commodity price, that's why hogs are losing money right now. That's because demand stays constant. When supply continues to increase, prices come down below point of profitability. So the answer is decrease supply. Well, does that mean that you just voluntarily do it? Most won't. So then the painful part, as you're talking about, Todd, means imagine all of a sudden when it's like, imagine Cargill or whatever, JBS. Imagine like one of them truly like their numbers become so out of whack. It usually won't be the bigs. It'll be some mid-level, right? But you're talking about still significant businesses, a vertical hog integrator, for instance, that has, I don't know what a mid-size would be, 20,000 sows or 60,000. You tell me, you're the expert. But the point is, they go out of business. Does that mean that those buildings just never get occupied again? You talk about the pain. You and I have said this before with our Business of Ag group. A hog barn is built to produce hogs. You don't turn it into self-storage units. Nobody wants to store their garage sale items at on County Road 300 West, a gravel road out in rural Sioux County. So there's an economic meltdown when the supply problem perpetuates, whether it's corn, soy, pork, wheat, name the stuff, Todd. The freaking economic meltdown, it perpetuates, and then all of a sudden you got some really bad blood on the streets.
Yeah, and that's really my concern. For my industry, is it's hard to see how we address that. Again, when I was talking to the reporter from the Wall Street Journal about the article that came out last weekend, he said, well, what are the solutions? And I said, well, that's the problem. There's not a lot of clear solutions. What do we need to do? Well, I think we need to reduce, the inventory, right? We need to reduce our production capacity. But how do you do that? What we really need is to get, a meeting together with the top 40 producers in the U.S. and agree on, making whatever the necessary cuts are and how we kind of right size the industry and how we keep it right sized moving forward. The problem is that would be completely illegal, a violation of price fixing and antitrust laws. So, there really are not any, easy answers here to how this actually gets done in a less painful way. So that's my real concern. And again, I think this pork discussion is just a preview of what the other commodities are going to have to deal with sooner rather than later.
Well, we've referenced particularly corn, soy, and pork. Those are three. First off, they're huge things that we produce in the United States, and also they're the three that indicate a lot. It could be almonds. I'm not a California almond expert. I've spoken to the California almond people once, but it's my understanding we glutted the hell out of the almond market. Now that's coming back a little bit, and that's due to water cost and environmental regulatory reasons that have made almond production prohibitive in some places. So therefore supply has decreased a bit, I'm told. This isn't just corn, pork, and soy is what I'm saying. We're just pretty damn good at making stuff. Apples. I worked for the tree fruit people in Washington State a year ago. We've got as many apples as we can, we've got too many an apple a day keeps a doctor away. We got a dozen apples a day. I mean, we've just got our productive capacity is remarkable, and we're probably oversupplied on just about everything.
Yeah, and especially in countries like ours, a lot of Western Europe, and we've gotten really good. I said one of my quotes from that article was that we're a lot of ways are victims of our own success, and that we really are. We've gotten really good at doing what we do. The problem is moving forward, that is going to have less value than it did, and so we've got to let go of that. And there's no reason we shouldn't be proud of the accomplishment that we've made over the last 50 to 100 years. I mean, we ought to be proud of that. It was arguably one of the biggest accomplishments in human history, and I'm certainly proud of my small role that I played in it. I think you probably are too, but what got us here is not going to get us there, and we've got to figure out how do we let go of that old narrative and develop a new narrative that serves us better.
I talk about it in my book about the past, present, and future of ag. I call it the amazing accomplishment to go from a situation not just of scarcity, but of true global starvation was more the common than not common 150 years ago, for God's sakes, to today where we've truly got these gluts. All right, so predictions. If you stuck around, I know this is an hour-long episode, but it's well worth it because you know what? You get to hang out with me and Todd. Someday, my big hope is that we get hired, both of us together, to do a panel, and then we can just be on stage and have a lot of fun. Plus, Todd and I get paid to get together on stage, and then we can have drinks afterwards because that's when we have our best discussions. You think we're smart now? You should wait until I'm on my fifth or sixth beer and he's on his fourth or fifth bourbon. He gets brilliant. I've got a couple predictions. And it's mostly U.S. because that's where I work, and so do you. There will be some not just belt tightening. There will be some failures. We'll start to see, or just exits of the market on a production side. I've been predicting consolidation at the farm level now for a while, and I said 4 years ago, I told my crowds we'll have half the number of farmers 10 years from now. So I think this is where it happens. Generally, farmers stay in the game about 3 years longer than they should, and that's because, hey, man, things are pretty good. Don't want to quit now. And then after they lose their shorts for about 2 years, they're getting out, and it's like, man, I can hardly afford to retire. Well, you could have 2 years ago. So I think there's going to be a lot of exiting. I think some of you're the pork guy, but in pork in particular, the smaller, the less efficient, the non-vertically integrated, some of those go away, but then also some of the large integrated probably fuse and consolidate. We'll see consolidation, which hasn't really happened as much in your industry since the washout of the late 90s. I think that there's going to be some challenge. I think we're going to start seeing it on the asset values in rural America because of some of this exiting of the market, because of the softening, because of the oversupply. I don't think 1 year a trend makes, but I would say that we are probably moving into a 2, 3, and 4 year trend of oversupply, therefore glutted markets, therefore cheaper commodity prices, which then comes back to the farm economy. There will be government lifelines tossed at this, and it'll be through USDA, and it'll be a little bit here and a little bit there. And there'll be, do we need to do this to prevent from having another 80s? It's not still the 1980s because everybody's position is good. But this article here in Pro Farmer talks about the capital position on farms. I think you're going to see some consolidation happening pretty quickly, and we're going to see some pain. And that's my prediction.
We've seen a lot of consolidation in the pork industry, and one of my arguments there is you can only consolidate so far, right? I mean, that's not a long-term solution. And so, is there more room to consolidate? Sure. I mean, but very quickly we're going to get to a point where that becomes more difficult, where you've got, antitrust issues that you're bumping up against and things like that. So, is that a short-term solution? Probably, at least a partial solution.
Well, the point is, Todd, consolidation doesn't create demand. It just makes production more efficient, which is the exact problem. So consolidation is more of an economic thing than that, economic survival. But we're still going to have the supply issue.
And it also tends to drive volatility in markets because you have less elasticity on the supply side. So if you go back and look at how different the swine industry is, between now and the 1980s. Well, in the 1980s, we had a lot of small producers that really didn't depend on pork production as their primary source of income. Right. And so we had a lot of elasticity in that supply side. They could get into the business when it made sense and get out when it didn't. They didn't have a lot of money invested in facilities. They weren't big. They had other sources of income. Now we have a complete opposite situation where we have very little elasticity. There's just none of those people left. There's none of those farmers left. And as we continue to consolidate more, there's even fewer and fewer of those people. So there's not even enough of them now to really have an impact on the supply side. So we have basically a fixed supply. And when we have weakness in demand, it drives, major volatility. So, that the consolidation is a solution that also it solves some problems and creates others.
On any other thing, using as an example, so like you said, consolidation generally just is an economic survival mode or whatever, but it doesn't do anything about decreasing supply. In fact, it contributes to even more supply because of more economies of scale, et cetera. So then the answer is going to be, well, we just got to open up more markets. We've already covered that. I think there's going to have to, if it's not voluntary, If it's not voluntary, I mean, I lived through the 80s when there was a dairy buyout. Same thing. We were oversupplied on milk. Well, here's the reality. We've been oversupplied on milk since the dairy buyout in 1986. It didn't decrease supply. It did briefly, and then it pushed up prices. And then what do the dairy people do? You tell them, by God, you can make an extra 4 cents every gallon of milk you make. They'll make more gallons of milk. You know what? The government will stay involved. This is another prediction because they don't want to see an absolute bloodbath in the farmer suicides spiking and bloodbath in the rural economy. I think if we have that kind of support, so the USDA probably becomes a lifeline in the next couple of years. But I don't see this oversupply changing in the next. We're recording this in February 24. I see it being a problem in 24, 25, 26. I don't see anything changing it in the short term.
Yeah, again, I think there'll be some ebbs and flows, but I think in general that's the direction that we're moving in. And the easy solutions are going to be temporary and painful, right? So if we need to really be working on, I published a post on LinkedIn today talking about donut economics, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about donut economics moving forward. And I think it's a bad solution. Right. But it is a solution. And unless we offer an alternative solution, those are the kind of solutions that are going to get implemented.
You're going to say, hey, wait, you can't leave us like this. I was doing my predictions in here. Donut economics. Give us the 30 seconds on there.
So it's a concept that says, okay, we have to find a balance between people's needs. And so the whole of the donut we have to avoid. So there's this interior barrier, and that's meeting people's basic needs. And then there's an exterior barrier with it, which is the carrying capacity of the planet, right? Essentially. So it's this Malthusian recycled idea that there's a fixed carrying capacity of the planet, right? And so my argument, on my post was that those are both ill-defined concepts, right? It's not a particularly good solution, but what does it lead to? It leads to distribution of resources. It leads to slower economic growth, those kind of things. And so, we can point out, like I did this morning, the weaknesses and the argument for donut economics as a potential solution. But unless we offer an alternative solution that is more free market, more capitalist friendly, then those are the solutions that are going to get implemented because they're the only ones out there.
So on supply management, which might be, I talked about it in episode 302, I recorded in July of 2023. Go back and look at it if you want, folks. I talk about supply management. You said getting the 40 big producers together and then deciding to fix supply. That's essentially what supply management is. It only works if it has a component of USDA adherence and approval, is my guess. I think the big, in terms of grain, supply management on the grain, well, the big ethanol is not going to like that because it's going to push up prices. The four big grain handlers, A, B, C, D, they're sure as heck not going to like it. But it would present a level of stability, or at least profit stability. But again, it flies in the face of free market economics.
Well, and you've said, is that where we're headed? That's what's going to happen? And my response to that has always been, it is, if we don't come up with a better plan, if we don't come up with an alternative. That's definitely where we're headed, because there's a historical precedence for that. It's a rather obvious solution, even though I think it's a really porous solution. But when it's competing against no solution, it's going to get implemented because there's no other option.
His name's Todd Thurman. You can find him on LinkedIn. You can also join us every other Friday if you want to join the Business of Ag Success Group. It's $99. It's no long-term subscription. We bring on guests. We have intelligent discussion like this. It kind of call it your mind-broadening sessions. That's what we do it for. We started clear back in 2020. So anyway, he's my co-host on all of that. He's awesome. Check him out on LinkedIn. He's a speaker. He's a consultant. He goes to China more than he should. Anyway, thanks for being here, Todd. I love this topic. We'll be visiting this more. If you want to be the first to bring us both on stage together, that's a session that I'm dreaming of. Like I said, we won't even charge you for the bonus part of getting to drink with us afterwards when we get really smart. But anyway, thanks for being here. Until next time, check out my business partners, Redox and TrueTerra. Go to their websites, redoxgrows.com or TrueTerraAg.com. Until next time, thanks for being here, Todd.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. I'm Damian Mason, and this is the Business of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for being here. This episode of the Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Pattern Ag. You've heard me talk about Pattern Ag because I think it's a pretty cool concept. New technology that allows you to predict the problems you're going to have and therefore treat them before those problems cost you money. What kind of problems am I talking about? Pests and disease. Things like cordon rootworm, sudden death syndrome, cyst nematode, and a whole bunch of other bad things that happen out there in the field that can cost you money. Guess what? Pattern Ag will let you find out ahead of time if the disease or the pest pressure is there, and therefore you're treating it before it costs you any money. What a great concept. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to learn more about their product, their technology, how it can make you money, save you yield, and also where you can find a rep that can come out there and do the work for you. Pattern.ag.